I think we often underestimate the spiritual or the potential of our real spiritual nature. And part of my work and part of the vision behind coming together is to explore or even activate the transformative potential of real spiritual energy, and the sense that it actually has a very vital role to play, not only in our own individual transformation. And many people here have been on their own journey long enough to have experienced that potential within themselves and how it can completely transform one's life. Sufis would talk about lifting the veil between ego consciousness and one's higher consciousness, but that it really takes you out of a very small space into an infinitely expanding space, into this dimension of the self that is within the heart. And then to take it, the next step is, what is this transformative potential, or what does this transformative potential mean for the whole? Because we seem as a culture to have become fixated on the individual, as if the individual's transformation or our own transformation is what it's all about. And we don't realize how much our cultural conditioning has contextualized us into this focus on the individual. We don't realize this is just a very recent paradigm, if you like, a very recent focus. And I remember somebody talking about shamanism and saying that the New Age never had much meaning for the shaman, because for the shaman it was always about the whole. That's all that ever mattered. And so it is to try and liberate one's own spiritual potential from this focus on the individual and individual fulfillment. Because of course one of the things you realize when you, I don't like to say get somewhere because there's nowhere to get, when you access something within yourself, is there is no such thing as an individual. This is one of the great illusions that our own ego consciousness presents to us. And once you step into the arena of oneness, what the Sufis called the arena of the heart, or the arena of love, then you realize that everything is one, and you are not part of that oneness, you are that oneness. And so then, how can we use what is within us, what is behind the veil of appearances within us, in service to the one, in service to this whole? And I want to talk this morning about light, because that is one way of exploring one's spiritual potential. It is there are whole esoteric traditions about working with light. One of the very first books I ever read, I think I was 18, and I read The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a Chinese Taoist classic that talks about creating the light body. And I was just incredibly moved by that, because I suddenly saw you can actually do that. It's a little book translated from the Chinese by Wilhelm that actually Carl Jung gave an introduction to. And it talks about creating a body of light, one's light body, that gives one the ability then to access a certain spiritual dimension. And so there is, in many different traditions, there is a whole esoteric knowledge of working with light. And so I want to use the image of working with light as a way to explore how we can use this spiritual potential within us. Now, we all have a certain light within us. It actually comes into this incarnation at 3 months when the soul comes into the fetus in the womb. It is part of the light of the soul or the light of the self. I use the word soul and self synonymously. And when a baby is born, you see it in the child. I think it is one of the reasons that a young baby gives us this extraordinary feeling of joy, is once again unknowingly we see that light, that purity of intention that we knew we once had. It's there in a baby. It is actually, in a way, their body is actually created out of light. It is part of the whole mystery of conception, and it has to do with the whole feminine mystery of creation, how a woman can give birth to a soul within herself. I don't want to go into that in detail now because I don't have the time. But when a baby is born, something in us responds, and there is this joy that also belongs to this purity of light that's there, that comes from one world into this world, and it touches something very deeply in us. The Sufis call this the spark in the heart, and it's there in a child. And it stays very present in the first few years of life, God willing. There's the English poet William Wordsworth, he talks about this. He had this direct experience as a child that he then remembered later on. And he says, if I can remember it correctly, not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. And then he begins to describe this transition. The prison walls close round the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. But it is that allows the child to have the direct experience of life. Because in this light of the self, which is within the child, you see and experience life directly. And how do you know that? Because later on the journey, when this light, through the grace of God, through some extraordinary happening, reawakens, you can once again have that direct experience that you had as a child. In Zen it's called Satori. That moment when once again the strawberry is just a strawberry. When in the classic Zen poem, the old pond, the frog jumps in, plop. There is that moment of direct experience which you have through the light of the self. If you didn't have access to the light of the self, you would not have that direct experience. The ego, as you well know, has very different experiences. It has experiences that involve judgment, comparison, and all the veils that the ego creates, all the distortions that the ego creates, to give you the apparent or the illusion of experiencing life. But there is this pure light of the self. As I say, it comes into the body, is given by the soul, by the self, into the human being. And it allows for this initial direct experience of life, the heaven being around us in our infancy. And then, as Wordsworth said, the prison walls close round the growing boy. My teacher, she said, really it's by the time you're 5 and you go to school and all the competition and all the education, it clouds it. You lose it. There is the possibility now that there are children being born today who don't have to lose it to such a degree as many of us did. Some call these children indigo children. I don't know exactly, but you lose it. It fades away, and you then begin to experience the world around you. And then, traditionally, there comes this moment, the Sufis call it tauba, the turning of the heart, when something extraordinary happens within the human being, and this light is again